Have you ever wondered how your grandma managed to create those magical Thanksgiving memories that still warm your heart today, even though she was probably running on 3 hours of sleep, a prayer, and whatever loose change she could find between the couch cushions? I'm about to take you back to the 1960s, when families were bigger, budgets were smaller, and somehow grandmothers across America were pulling off Thanksgiving miracles that would make today's Pinterest-perfect hostesses weep into their organic cranberry sauce. Today, I'm sharing 25 authentic 1960s Thanksgiving recipes that were dirt cheap but fooled everyone into thinking you were dining at the finest establishments. These aren't just recipes, they're time machines to an era when creativity trumped credit cards, and a dollar could stretch further than you ever imagined. In the leaner post-war years, not every family could afford a big bird. Enter the mock turkey loaf, a thrifty miracle made from ground pork and veal, molded into a loaf pan and brushed with butter and paprika to mimic that glossy turkey skin. Housewives shaped it lovingly, sometimes tucking in a few toothpicks for drumsticks. The result looked close enough that kids at the table did not ask questions until carving time. What mattered most was the smell: sage, onion, and that buttery crust drifting through the house. Betty reminded readers that it was not about the size of the roast, but the care in its making. For many families, that loaf was their Thanksgiving turkey, carved proudly, served with canned cranberry sauce, and remembered with fondness long after the gravy ran out. If you could not swing a turkey, Betty had a solution that felt just as grand: a stuffed chicken. She called it a perfect feast for 4. Housewives would rub the skin with shortening, pack in a rich bread dressing made from day-old crusts, celery, and onion, then baste it like it was the real deal. The key was presentation. Laid on a platter with parsley sprigs and a scoop of cranberry jelly, it looked like prosperity itself. The 1950s homemaker did not apologize for stretching the budget. She made it sparkle. Even the gravy was enhanced with bouillon cubes and a little flour magic. It was not about cutting corners. It was about making the most of what you had and still feeling like you had hosted Thanksgiving properly. Betty loved a good illusion, and nothing fooled the eye like a ham loaf wearing a pineapple crown. Ground ham, a little ground pork, crushed crackers, and milk turned into something that looked and smelled like luxury. That glossy pineapple ring on top added the right 1950s glamour, the kind you would see in better homes and gardens. The glaze was usually a mix of brown sugar and mustard, cooked until sticky and brushed over the loaf like shellac. Housewives could make 2 loaves for less than the price of a single ham. Betty encouraged them to slice it thick for holiday generosity. Served with sweet potatoes and a molded salad, it was middle-class magic, thrift wrapped in good taste. One dish that proved comfort did not have to be costly was scalloped corn. Betty Crocker called it a golden spoon dish, and it earned its spot on countless Thanksgiving tables in the 1950s. Made with creamed corn, crushed saltines, a splash of milk, and an egg or 2, it baked into a soft, custardy side that puffed up like pride itself. Housewives loved it because it used pantry staples, and the kids never complained because it tasted like cornbread pudding. Some topped it with a sprinkle of paprika or a few pats of margarine for that buttered illusion. The scent of corn and cream filling a small kitchen on Thanksgiving morning still brings back memories of cozy, affordable abundance. Betty Crocker did not invent this sugary wonder. She sure made it famous and affordable. By the mid-1950s, her cookbooks were brimming with versions that used canned yams, a spoonful of brown sugar, and a handful of marshmallows, toasted just long enough to turn golden. It looked elegant enough for a photo spread, but cost barely a few dimes. Housewives loved that it doubled as both a side and a dessert, a little 2-for-1 Betty wisdom. Sweet, creamy, and undeniably nostalgic, It became the taste of mid-century Thanksgiving thrift, proving you could feed the family, delight the neighbors, and never once feel poor. To homemakers in the 1950s, leftover mashed potatoes were not waste. They were opportunity. Betty Crocker's mashed potato puff turned yesterday's spuds into something guests would swear was new. She had cooks whip the potatoes with milk, a dab of margarine, and an egg to make them rise high and golden in the oven. Housewives proudly baked them in Pyrex dishes and sprinkled a touch of paprika on top for color, because even thrift needed flair. The puff came out light and creamy inside, crisp at the edges, and smelling faintly of buttered air. Betty taught that presentation could transform the ordinary, and in a time when every penny counted, that was true alchemy. Those little puffs reminded families that frugality did not have to mean plain. It could mean resourceful and even beautiful. Canned goods were Betty's secret weapon, and none earned a spot on the holiday table quite like creamed onions and peas. It was an old-fashioned dish dressed up for modern convenience. A can of small onions, a can of peas, and a homemade white sauce. Sauce whisked from milk, butter, and flour. Housewives added a dash of nutmeg, Betty's gourmet touch, and poured the mixture into casserole dishes that had seen 100 Sunday dinners. It felt refined, even though the ingredients came straight from the pantry shelf. For many, this dish was a small triumph. Creamy, delicate, and just fancy enough to make guests think you'd gone all out, when really, you'd spent less than 50 cents. In the years before boxed stuffing mix, Betty Crocker reminded home cooks that anything dry and crumbly could become a feast. Saltine crackers stood in for bakery bread when loaves ran short. Housewives crushed them by hand, added sautéed onion and celery, and moistened the mixture with broth made from bouillon cubes. The result baked up golden, crisp at the edges and savory at the center. It was resourceful cooking at its best, the kind that didn't need measuring cups to feel right. Some cooks even slipped in a little minced giblet for flavor, stretching a humble chicken into something worthy of company. Betty taught a whole generation that it wasn't what you bought that made a meal memorable. It was what you did with it. By the mid-1950s, Betty Crocker had a friendly rival in Campbell's, and the two brands joined forces in kitchens across America. The green bean casserole was the modern miracle, a thrifty 3-ingredient side that looked elegant in any Pyrex dish. Canned green beans, cream of mushroom soup, and a handful of crispy fried onions turned into the era's most beloved company vegetable. Betty's cookbooks praised its simplicity, reminding homemakers that guests did not care how long you slaved, just that it tasted like home. Families loved the creamy, salty crunch, and mothers loved how it cost barely $1. It became a national tradition almost overnight, proof that thrift and flavor could live side by side on the Thanksgiving table. No Thanksgiving was complete without a quivering tower of jellied cranberry mold. Betty's version used canned cranberry sauce, a packet of gelatin, and maybe a splash of orange juice if you were feeling fancy. Housewives poured it into ring molds or bundt pans and let it chill overnight, unveiling it with the pride of a sculptor. It wasn't just dessert, it was centerpiece art. Betty encouraged cooks to garnish with lettuce leaves for a festive touch, as if anyone at the table cared about lettuce when there was Jell-O involved. But the dish sparkled under kitchen light, catching reflections of tinsel and hope. Cheap, cheerful, and unmistakably mid-century, that wobbly cranberry ring became the soundless anthem of post-war gratitude. For mid-century hostesses, entertaining didn't have to mean spending. Betty Crocker's deviled ham spread was a lifesaver. A clever mix of canned ham, a little mustard, and just enough mayonnaise to make it spreadable. Housewives spooned it into cut-crust sandwiches or piped it onto crackers with a sprig of parsley for what Betty called instant party charm. Shelf life meant that little can could sit in the pantry for months, waiting for unexpected company. when homemakers prided themselves on always being prepared for guests, this dip felt downright sophisticated. It tasted smoky, salty, and comforting, like a cross between a sandwich filling and a secret weapon. For many families, it was the humble heart of the appetizer tray that made Thanksgiving feel abundant before the main course even began. Lima beans were one of those humble pantry staples that quietly held the line when the Thanksgiving budget got tight in the 1960s, and Betty Crocker knew it. Every mid-century pantry had at least one red and white box of dried limas tucked beside the elbow macaroni, ready to be turned into something warm and steady on the Thanksgiving table. Moms would soak them in the same Pyrex bowl they used for every church potluck, letting them plump overnight on the counter like tiny pale coins. When it was time to sit and eat, the house smelled like onions softening in a skillet and a pat of butter melting into a little puddle of gold. Betty's cookbook suggested stretching them with a splash of evaporated milk, a shake of paprika, and whatever scraps of ham or bacon you'd squirreled away from Sunday. Some families stirred in a spoonful of ketchup for color, while others swore the secret was a bay leaf tucked in like a good luck charm. But most families just liked them simple, with nothing but butter, salt, and a little bit of pepper. It wasn't farm-fresh pumpkins. It was canned Libby's, blended with evaporated milk and just the right spice mix. Betty's genius was in making it foolproof. One bowl, no scalded cream, no tempering eggs. Housewives could whip it up between ironing and setting. On the table, the pie baked into a smooth, custardy filling with that unmistakable canned pumpkin scent, warm, spicy, and comforting. Topped with a swirl of Dream Whip or a drizzle of condensed milk, it became the taste of post-war gratitude. Betty taught that dessert didn't need to be extravagant. It just needed to make the house smell like home. To stretch leftover turkey or chicken, Betty Crocker turned to her most loyal helper, Bisquick. Her biscuit-topped pot pie layered chopped meat and canned vegetables in a creamy sauce, then topped the whole thing with biscuit dough brushed in melted margarine. It baked into a bubbling golden masterpiece that looked like something right out of Ladies' Home Journal. Families loved that it transformed scraps into supper. Kids loved cracking through that top crust. In her cookbooks, Betty Crocker called it an economy dish with Sunday flair, the kind of praise that made every homemaker feel like she had pulled off a small miracle. It was thrift disguised as tradition, and it filled the kitchen with the smell of plenty. Before packaged stuffing mixes appeared, cornbread dressing was the thrift cook's secret weapon. Betty Crocker featured versions that used every crumb of yesterday's skillet bread. No waste, no guilt. Mixed with onion, celery, broth, and a pat of margarine, it baked into a fragrant casserole that could stretch a meal twice over. Housewives made it in enamel pans, their kitchens filled with the smell of browned cornmeal and sage. It wasn't fancy, but it was deeply personal. Every family had their own ratio of moist to crumbly. Betty reminded cooks that tradition didn't have to be expensive. It only had to be shared. That's why, even today, the scent of cornbread dressing feels like the holiday itself. Humble, hearty, and full of love. Tomato soup cake was one of those 1960s desserts that made kids suspicious and adults downright proud of their own creativity. It came straight from the pantry. One can of condensed tomato soup, a couple handfuls of raisins, and the same spice blend people used for their holiday quick breads. Moms loved it because it used what they already had on hand, and Betty Crocker happily encouraged the trend in her recipe booklets. Anything that stretched a dessert without stretching the budget was fair game. The magic happened in the mixing bowl. That bright orange soup would disappear the second it hit the flour and cinnamon, turning into a warm, gingery batter that smelled like the holidays the moment it hit the oven. By the time it cooled, no one could guess the secret ingredient unless you told them. And even then, they'd take another bite just to be sure. For Thanksgiving, families often topped it with a simple powdered sugar glaze or a thin swipe of cream cheese frosting. It was thrifty, surprising, and strangely comforting. the kind of dessert that stuck with you years after it stopped showing up on the Thanksgiving dessert table. It's funny, when we flip through those old Betty Crocker cookbooks today, the recipes can look so simple they almost feel quaint. They were a lifeline for families who wanted their holidays to feel full, even when their wallets weren't. Betty taught an entire generation that thrift didn't mean settling. It meant crafting joy out of what you had. Every can of pumpkin, every handful of crackers, every spoon of evaporated milk told a quiet story about resourcefulness and pride. And somehow those little dishes, stacked on Corelle plates and served beside wax-dripped candles, still felt like abundance. Maybe that's what made those mid-century Thanksgivings so memorable. Not the cost, but the care. In the 1950s, butter was a luxury item, and Betty Crocker knew it. That's why her dinner roll recipes proudly featured Crisco, the all-purpose miracle of the modern kitchen. Housewives scooped it from the blue tin with a measuring spoon, creamed it into the dough, and marveled at how soft the rolls turned out. Betty called it the secret to tender texture, and she wasn't wrong. When those golden rolls came out of the oven, brushed with a whisper of melted margarine for shine, they looked like bakery perfection. The smell alone could make a small kitchen turn into the heart of the house in a matter of seconds. Powdered milk was one of the quiet workhorses of the kitchens of the 1950s, and Betty Crocker found ways to make it glamorous. Her economy popovers used reconstituted milk, whisked with eggs, a little flour, and a pinch of salt. Housewives loved that they puffed up dramatically in the oven, like a magic trick that cost almost nothing. They came out crisp at the edges, hollow in the center, and ready to hold gravy or jam, depending on the meal. Betty called them a showy side on a sensible budget, and she was right. The popovers' gentle rise mirrored the optimism of the decade, proof that even the most modest ingredients could surprise you if treated with care. Betty's pumpkin bread was more than dessert. It was a budget stretcher. Using canned pumpkin, reconstituted milk, and a handful of raisins, it filled the house with the scent of cinnamon and nutmeg long before the guests arrived. It baked into a dense, moist loaf that sliced beautifully, perfect for breakfast the next morning. Housewives often wrapped it in wax paper and sent a few pieces home with guests because nothing from Betty Crocker's kitchen ever went to waste. In her cookbooks, she described it as sweet comfort from the pantry. Affordable, nostalgic, and endlessly forgiving. The kind of recipe you could trust to make everything feel a little better. Real pecans were pricey, especially outside the South, so Betty Crocker offered a thrifty alternative, the mock pecan pie. Instead of nuts, it used old-fashioned oats stirred into a sticky brown sugar syrup that baked into chewy, caramelized perfection. From the top, it even looked like pecans. Housewives cut neat slices and served them proudly, topped with whipped Dream Whip or a drizzle of condensed milk. The trick fooled plenty of guests, and no one complained once they took a bite. It was sweet, simple, and smart, a Betty Crocker hallmark. In a time when every ingredient had to earn its keep, this pie was proof that creativity could taste downright indulgent. For homemakers who wanted something dramatic but inexpensive, Betty's coconut snowball cake was the showstopper. It started with a boxed cake mix, a marvel of modern convenience, and ended with coconut flakes that made it look like winter on a plate. Some used white frosting made from shortening and powdered sugar. Others reached for Dream Whip. Either way, it gleamed under the dining room light like a sugary ornament. Betty knew the trick was in the presentation. One perfect layer cake could make a budget meal feel grand. It wasn't just dessert. It was a reminder that joy could be homemade, even when store-bought ingredients made it possible. Betty Crocker believed that a holiday dessert didn't have to come from a bakery. It could rise from a mixing bowl. Her gelatin fruit whip was the budget miracle of its day. One box of Jell-O, a can of evaporated milk, and whatever fruit was hiding in the pantry. Gelatin was mixed until it was thick but not firm, then beaten until frothy, folding in the milk and fruit until it looked like pink clouds in a Pyrex dish. Light, airy, and sweet, it felt fancy, even though it cost almost nothing. Kids loved the wobble, husbands loved the sweetness, and Betty loved the efficiency, because she knew thrift could still sparkle like a treat from the soda fountain. Every Betty Crocker cookbook from the 1950s had a page devoted to this thrifty favorite. Date nut bread was hearty and simple, made from chopped dates, a few walnuts, and strong coffee poured into the batter to deepen the flavor. Once baked, it was sliced thin and spread with a layer of cream cheese, rolled into little sandwiches, and served. On the fancy platter, housewives loved that it doubled as both dessert and breakfast, stretching one loaf through the entire weekend. The taste was sweet but wholesome, just enough indulgence to feel like the holidays without emptying the sugar jar. Betty called it hospitality in a loaf, and that is exactly what it was. Cheese was expensive in the 1950s, so Betty Crocker showed families how to make a little go a long way. Her cheese potatoes were thin-sliced and baked in a white sauce flavored with just a sprinkle of grated cheddar. Barely a handful, but enough to perfume the whole dish. Housewives called it holiday au gratin when guests came over. The top browned beautifully, the edges crisped up, and nobody guessed it was made with powdered milk and a budget-sized cheese block. Served beside turkey, ham loaf, or even just green beans, it brought warmth and comfort to the table. In every spoonful was the quiet pride of making something rich out of almost nothing. No dish better captured the 1950s whimsy than Lime Ribbon Delight, a 2-layer gelatin dessert that looked like it came straight from a magazine ad. Betty's version combined lime jello with cream cheese, whipped topping, and canned pineapple. It was light, colorful, and practically shouted modern homemaker. Housewives poured it into clear glass dishes so the layers showed off like a fashion statement. And at barely $1 for the entire recipe, it was elegance on a budget. Betty knew her audience, women who wanted their tables to feel special, even when grocery money was tight. That bright green ribbon of gelatin was more than dessert. It was optimism in a bowl. Betty Crocker made fruitcake fun again in the 1950s by shrinking it into something sweet and personal. Tiny loaves baked in muffin tins. Using candied fruit bits and leftover nuts, she called them jeweled fruitcake miniatures, a thrifty nod to luxury. They wrapped up beautifully in wax paper or foil and were often given as gifts to neighbors or teachers. The smell of warm spice and candied citrus filled the kitchen, making even modest homes feel festive. These little cakes represented what Betty did best, taking something ordinary, practical, and frugal, and turning it into an act of celebration. Looking back, it's easy to see why those 1950s Thanksgiving tables still live in our memories. Betty Crocker didn't just teach America how to cook. She taught us how to make joy on a budget, how to feed a family with grace, and how to make every guest feel like the meal was made just for them. Her recipes weren't about extravagance. They were about love. Today, when grocery bills climb and the world moves too fast, maybe we can still learn something from those pages. That thrift can be beautiful, that resourcefulness can taste like tradition, and that a truly cozy Thanksgiving isn't about what you spend, it's about what you share.